Hi everybody. I hope you've had a really good weekend and you're ready for the start of another school week. It was lovely to see everybody in school last week when we had our first week back for the summer term, and really lovely to see how most people, nearly everybody, was making some really good choices, taking the responsibility for the choices they made, whether that was in the classroom and those learning behaviour choices where you're showing good listening, where you're asking good questions, where you're thinking about things, where you might not get something quite right, but you don't give up and you try again. And about being organised, all of those really good choices that help your learning in the classroom, or whether those choices were around the school, whether it was walking down the corridors to make sure that you keep yourself and others safe, about whether you have been taking care of others if you've seen somebody else fall over, and showing good manners and courtesy as you go, holding the door open for the person behind you. Those choices make such a difference, and so many of you have shown last week that you're really good at taking that responsibility and making those choices for yourself. So thank you for that. It's been really lovely to watch, see and hear. And that is what we're thinking about this week, or this half term, is our value of responsibility. I'm just going to share the screen so that you can see our poster that we've got that you all know about, our poster that reminds us about the things we'll see each other doing if we're showing good responsibility to each other. And that doesn't mean that we forget about respect, about aspirations, about becoming more confident, our other school values. But it means that at this half term, we're just focusing that little bit more, thinking that little bit more about responsibility and how we can do that. But I particularly wanted to think today about the responsibility of making those right choices, because that can be really difficult at times. I was in nursery at the end of last week, and I was watching some of the children with their learning, and so two little boys were playing with, they had built a fantastic building using the building blocks, and they had made a dinosaur museum and put all the dinosaur toys in there. And another little boy came across and asked if he could play. And one of the little boys looked up and said, no. Well, I wondered what's going to happen. What choices are those people going to make? Well, the little boy who wanted to play could have got cross, could have got angry, could have shouted, could have pushed over their model or their dinosaurs, but actually he didn't. He talked to them. He made some really good choices, and he talked to them and said, but I'd like to, I can help. I'm quite good at building. I built a great tower yesterday. And eventually the three boys talked and they made some really good choices. And that's the youngest children in our school making those really good choices. So that was really lovely to see. But we know, I know, you know, sometimes it can be really hard to make the right choice. And sometimes we make the wrong choice and we learn from it. We know afterwards that wasn't the right thing to do. But we learn, and that's the key bit. So it's really important. And even for adults find sometimes making the right choice can be difficult. And sometimes adults do things that they shouldn't do because they make the wrong choice. And that's why it's so important that we think about our responsibilities right from nursery upwards, that we learn how to make those good choices that help us and keep us safe and keep us happy. And today I'm going to tell you a story about two men, Hans and Joseph, who both were grown men. And they had difficulty making choices. Hans and Joseph were amazing craftsmen. They'd always been good at art and enjoyed making things, and were very skilled at using hammers and chisels. And what they used to make was fantastic carvings out of big pieces of wood. And they would use their hammers and their chisels to knock away at the wood, chip bits away, and they would create these fantastic shapes. Sometimes they were people, like statues made of wood. Sometimes they would be animals. Sometimes they would just be patterns carved into the wood. But they were amazing, and everybody in their village knew that they were amazing and loved the sculptures they made through their carvings. And each week, Hans and Joseph would travel down from their village, which was a long way up in the mountainside. They would go down the windy road to the town where there were more people. They would set up their market stall. They would put all their carvings out onto the market stall, and people would come from around the town and the villages around, and hopefully they would buy some of their carvings. And each morning when they went to market, they would have to load up their donkey with all the carvings that they'd made, because they were quite heavy. They couldn't carry themselves, and the donkey was strong and fit. So they would strap the carvings onto the donkey. They would put the things they needed for their market stall onto the donkey, and they would walk down the hillside into the town setup, ready for the day. Well, one day when they went to market, they had the most successful day they had ever had. They sold every single sculpture that they had taken, every carving that they had made. People had come from the town, come from the villages around, and bought their sculptures, their carvings, and they'd paid them the money. And at the end of the day, the two men stood there really proud of themselves, because it was lovely that people enjoyed their work so much. But they stood there really proud, but they also stood there with an awful lot of money. They took the money, and it was quite heavy because a lot of it was coins, and they put the money into a big sack, and they strapped it as well as they could onto the donkey's saddle. And because they only had one donkey, they used to take it in turns when they walked back up to the village to ride on the donkey, and one would walk alongside. And then they would swap over, because it was a really long trudge all the way up the road to the village where they lived. They couldn't ride the donkey down the hill because it was always carrying all the carvings, the wood carvings and the sculptures that they'd made. But on the way home, that's what they would do. So they strapped the money on and off they set. And Joseph was riding on the donkey, and Hans was walking alongside. And by the time they'd set off from the market, the sun was high in the sky, and it was blisteringly hot. It wasn't very long before they came out of the town and started the long climb up the road back towards their village. They trudged along, chatting to each other. And as they chatted, Hans was getting more and more tired, because he was the one that was walking. And Joseph was quite happy sitting on the donkey. Well, not very far up the hill, Hans said, "Surely, Joseph, it's my turn now to have the ride on the donkey, and then we can swap over later." Well, Joseph looked down at him and said, "Well, I'm just going to go a little bit further, Hans. We haven't gone very far yet." Okay, said Hans. And they kept on trudging up the hill. They didn't talk quite so much now, because Hans was getting more tired. And it wasn't long before he stopped again and said, "Joseph, come on, now it's my turn. You need to come off the donkey and let me have a turn at riding." Joseph said, "Well, Hans, just a little bit further. Look, up there, you can see those rocks. I'm just going to ride up to the rocks, and then it will be your turn." "Really?" said Hans. I'm so tired. I've walked all the way so far. Just by the rocks, said Joseph. We'll get there and we'll swap. But when they got to the rocks, Hans was ready to swap. And Joseph looked at Hans and said, oh, Hans, I'll tell you what, let me just go to that next set of rocks. Can we? And then we'll swap over and you can go all the way then back to the village. Oh, Hans looked at him. You are joking, he said. No, come on, Hans, it will be fair. We'll do half each. Well, Hans was tired. He was worn out. He was hot. He had sweat coming from his brow. All he wanted to do was have his turn on the donkey. So they started arguing and said, this isn't fair. This isn't fair, Joseph. You've been all the way so far. Joseph said, well, I only want to go a bit further and then you've got it all the way. If you don't get off, said Hans, I'm going to pull you off the donkey. Well, Joseph said, well, you can try, but you're not going to. I'm going to ride to the next rocks and then it's your turn. Well, Hans grabbed hold of Joseph's legs and he started pulling his leg. He started yanking him. And Joseph was trying to get him off. And eventually he pulled so hard that Joseph fell off the horse and they both landed up on the ground. They stood up shouting at each other. It's my turn. No, it's not. It's yours. I said you could have a go in a minute. They shouted and screamed. They had their fists clenched. They were really cross with each other. And in the commotion, the donkey had been scared and run off up the road. And as he ran, the bag of money had started to slip off the side of his saddle, untie where it had been tied on. It got looser and looser. And as the donkey ran round the rocks up in front of them, the money fell off the donkey's saddle and over onto the mountainside and down over the cliff. They had lost the money. They had lost the donkey. They stood there. They looked at each other. They realised they had no donkey. They were both going to have to walk all the way back to the village, and they had no money because it had fallen over the side. They hadn't tied it on securely enough. They didn't know the donkey was going to be running or galloping away. And the two men stood in silence. I wonder whose fault do you think it was that they lost the donkey and the money? Was it Hans because he pulled Joseph and tried to get him off the horse? Was it Joseph's because he wouldn't get off the horse and let Hans have his turn? Maybe you can think about that. But somewhere they didn't make a good choice. And because they didn't make a good choice, they both lost out. So hopefully we can think ourselves, we're not going to be like Hans and Joseph, so that we can actually stop, use our thinking brains and make good choices. Just like the boys I watched in nursery. And everybody was much happier because of it. Think about that this week. Are you making the good choices? Are you making good learning choices in the classroom? Are you making good choices about how you behave, walk, move around the school? Have a great week. Look forward to seeing you in your class, getting on with your work, and showing some of those really good learning behaviours.